Good morning from South Central Texas. My name's Charles from CP Web Designs, and today I would like to take about 30 minutes to share how I utilize XAMPP for my internal development. If you're not aware, XAMPP is a free and open source cross-platform web server solution stack. It was developed by Apache friends and consists of the Apache web server, Mariah database, and script interpreters for PHP and Perl. In today's tutorial, I would like to cover how to install XAMPP, in this instance on a Windows environment, and create multiple virtual hosts to include self-signed SSL certificates. This will ultimately make it easier for you to maintain and manage your internal development. The only requirement is that you have a compatible operating system, a text editor, and you're comfortable editing configuration files. One caveat is that the default installation of XAMPP is not really appropriate for a production environment without making security modifications. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump on in. So this is Oracle VirtualBox. It's a virtual server environment, basically. And I've currently set up a standalone XAMPP instance. Right now it is only a base install of Windows 10. So we're going to go ahead and fire this up. So my virtual machine is now fired up. And just to cover some of the details about how I set this up. So the virtual machine itself is configured to use 4 CPU cores from my host machine and 6 gigs of RAM. And the hard drive is currently set for 50 gigs. And it is basically a self-expanding virtual disk image, which is one of the features of VirtualBox. In order to download our XAMPP installer, you need to visit apachefriends.org, and on the main page they give you the top 3 installations. So they've got XAMPP for Windows, which includes PHP 8.2.0, XAMPP for Linux, and XAMPP for OS 10. If you want to look at any of the older versions of XAMPP, you can click the link right here listed for other versions, and they'll give you the last 3 versions by default, and then you can dig even deeper for even older copies. So if you wanted XAMPP with PHP 7.4, you'll be able to find that downloader in here. But what we're going to do is we're going to download the installer that includes PHP 8.2. And now we just have to wait for the download to complete. Now that our download is complete, we can go into our downloads folder, and we have our installer. So you've got 2 options. You can strictly double-click the installer, or you can right-click and choose Run as Administrator. Most users are just going to double-click. So we will just go the general route here to get the installer going. And my virtual machine seems to be running a little bit slower than usual right now. All right, so this is one of those notices that you need to pay attention to because of the security features of Windows 10. Unless you've deactivated user account control, some features may not work 100% as expected on the installer, but the installer will complete. So selecting components, if there's features that you don't need to use, you can disable them here, such as the mail server or Tomcat. If you don't need them, you can disable them, but we're just going to leave them all enabled. And we're going to keep the standard or default installation location and select your language as appropriate. And we're going to let the installer complete its work. So this will take a few minutes to complete, so we'll be back when it's done. Our installer has completed, and it's prompting us to open the XAMPP control panel right now. You can uncheck this box if you'd prefer, because you really can't do much by default, and I will show you what I mean by that. So here is the XAMPP control panel. So you'll notice that, you know, it lists all of the components here: Apache, MySQL, FileZilla, the mail server, and Tomcat. The checkboxes over here to the left allow you to enable them as a service, but by default, because this control panel is not running as an administrator user at the moment, that is why we cannot install the service. So I am going to close the control panel, and down in the taskbar, you're going to find the icon for it and quit the control panel. And there we go. So it is closed, and it just took a second to close. I'm going to get rid of the open windows. So now click on the start menu, find your XAMPP control panel, right click on the app and run as administrator. So now that we're running it as administrator, we've got the option to enable the services. So we're going to enable Apache, and we're going to enable the MySQL service. If you want to use the FTP server, you can enable the FileZilla service. In this case, because I'm running it on a local network, I do not really need the FTP service running at the moment. So services are installed, and we will check the Windows Services tab, and you will see there is Apache. And as we scroll, we will find MySQL service is also installed. All right, they are currently not running because we did not tell them to start. So we're going to start Apache, and we're going to start MySQL. And this tells us that Apache is listening on both port 80 and port 443, and MySQL is listening on port 3306. So if we fire up Firefox again, and we go to local host, there is our local XAMPP control panel, or the local host instance. So contained within the default install is the frequently asked questions for XAMPP. So they do have some good information here in the FAQs. They've got a link to the how-to guides. They've got a default PHP info page. So you can see that we are running, in fact, PHP 8.2.0 on Apache with OpenSSL. And the default phpMyAdmin is also accessible here, and these are the default databases that get installed. So this is all fine and dandy. And if we go to our C drive and our default install folder, so the default local host is being served from the XAMPP htdocs directory. So just a little bit of background. The Apache folder is where we find all the configuration files for Apache. The MySQL folder is where all the configuration files, of course, for MariaDB are held. There is a folder for PHP itself, so that's where you'd find the PHP ini file. And then PHP my admin, of course, that's where the web interface for managing your databases are served from. So the next step, if we're going to use this for local development, and we want to actually utilize pseudo domain names, we need to dig into the Apache configuration files. So we're going to go to the Apache folder and the conf folder. And the first file we're going to find is the httpd.conf. So we're going to open this file. I'm just going to review the settings here really quick. So default server root is, of course, the Apache folder. You'll find the load module directives, which tells Apache what to load as far as additional functionality goes. A little bit later on, we are going to go ahead and add or uncomment, I will say, we'll uncomment one of these load module lines for the HTTP2, which will basically improve request performance. And that's really used mostly for SSL requests. Further down, so we've got the default server admin email. You can change this to be your email address. The default server name is localhost port 80. They've got security directives for the default htdocs folder. If you're not aware, many years ago, htdocs was the predecessor really for public HTML. That was all started back in the Mosaic and Netscape server days. So we've got configurations here, basically restricting access for htaccess, htpassword files. Log file formats. So if you're not familiar with those, there's a really good reference on the Apache manual website. So you can modify how your logs get stored. Default script aliases, permissions, file types, error documents. So all of the generic settings for Apache are contained within this file. So the files that we're going to look at next are the httpd vhosts, which is basically where you define your non-SSL virtual host, and the httpd SSL config file. So those are the two files where we define our virtual hosts. One, like I said, one is for non-SSL and the other one is SSL specific. But a little bit of prep work that I prefer to do is I basically put all of my virtual hosts or development sites in a separate folder. So in this case, back at the C drive, or the root of the C drive, I'm going to create a sites folder. perfect instance, I would have three SATA SSD drives. The first, of course, being the operating system and applications. The second drive would be where I would store my virtual hosts, and the third drive is where I would store my databases. That'll help. That'll help performance once you get to a certain point. But for demonstration purposes, there's not really a requirement for three standalone drives. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a couple of additional folders underneath the sites, and widget developer, and widget company. So these are the two virtual hosts that I'm going to build out. And within each of these, we're going to create the directory that's going to store our web documents. We're going to create a directory for server logs, and we're going to create a directory for the SSL configuration files. So I typically use htdocs as my document root, but since most web hosts nowadays use public HTML, that's what I'm going to go ahead with in this example, just because it might make more sense for everybody else. Create a logs file or folder, excuse me, and then I'm going to create an SSL folder. Now, I'll reiterate, SSL is not going to be the doc root for the SSL. The public HTML folder will be the document root for both the SSL enabled virtual host and the non-SSL virtual host. The SSL folder will hold the configuration file and the certificates that we're going to generate a little bit later. All right. So now that I've created the folders in this virtual host, I'm going to go ahead and go to the second one, and I'm going to paste in the same folder names. All right. And just for demo purposes, I'm going to create an index.html. And I'm also going to create an info.php file. Within info.php, we are simply going to call the function php info. And in index.html, we are simply going to put in some placeholder tags. Make sure I did that one right. Yep. So widget company. Okay. So with the placeholder files created in widget company, I'm just going to copy those two files over to widget developer. And I am simply going to edit Welcome to widget. Sorry, my fingers got to the wrong spot on the keyboard. All right, so our two virtual host folders are created. We've got an index.html, we've got an info.php, and we've got our preparatory directories for logs and the SSL configuration files. So now we just need to go back into our XAMPP folder, go to Apache, config, and remember we're looking for the config extra HTTPD vhosts, and we'll open that with Notepad. So in here, one of the things that we need to look at, so name virtual host, we don't really need to worry about this piece so much, but one of the extra configuration options that we definitely need to look at is the canonical name. So one of the directives that we want to use is the use canonical name, and we want to turn that off. And right now my copy and paste is not working. So use canonical name off. So what that does is basically it kind of assists with disabling the lookups back to the root server name. So basically, it allows the host name that gets passed in the HTTP headers gets utilized instead of the core server name directive. So that allows us to use both server name and server alias, which will make a little bit more sense here in a few minutes. I'll move that over into. Oh, sorry about that. I'm dragging the wrong window around. It's easy to get confused using a virtual host. So they give us examples of how to use the virtual host directives, which ultimately you just have to copy and paste and change the placeholder text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment this first virtual host. Yeah. Notepad being built in, not the easiest solution for editing sometimes. If you've got another editor that you prefer to use, that would be highly recommended. A lot of times, like Virtual Studio Code or PHP Storm or other editors have built-in features for editing config files. So one of the other pieces that I want to look at, though, before we jump that far, which I think it was in XAMPP. With Notepad. No, it was not in that one. HTTP default, maybe. sometimes it's easy to forget where these additional configuration options are. Okay, so CNAME off is already in the default config. Hostname lookups is turned off. All right. So just to make sure that things work in sequence. So the default configuration, default. So that file is actually being included twice in the XAMPP installer, which they didn't need to do it that way. I'm going to move my virtual host config include down to after that. And I'm also going to move the XAMPP configuration up just a little bit. And do a little bit of indenting just to make things easier to read. All right, so all I kind of did is because they had this include statement in this file twice. I basically deleted one of the includes for the default configuration, and then I moved the virtual host config down below the default. So let's minimize that one. Okay, so there's our virtual hosts, and I'm going to make a comment down below. Default virtual host, which this will basically become a fallback if it does not match any of the directives. Since the CNAME directive was already enabled, I'm going to delete that again. So webmaster at widget company dot local. So this document root we're going to change since we did this in a separate directory structure. Widget company slash public HTML. And our server name is going to become widget company dot local. Now, the reason that I use the dot local is that if you're using any application, so a lot of people are going to use XAMPP for WordPress development or maybe Magento local development or Joomla. I find .local, it doesn't require external DNS. You can do this all via host file. And in the instance of a WordPress development site, if you're using any plugin that uses like the Freemius framework, .local is one of those domains that does not require a separate license. So if you've got a plugin that you've only got like 3 licenses for, typically any domain ending with .local will not count against your license count. So that is why I typically use .local, but it's also easier to differentiate whether you're on your production site or your development site. Widget widgetcompany.local. And we're going to also, we're going to copy that and we're going to place that before the logs file or the logs folder there. So this is basically telling the server what's the domain name and what's the alias for it. You can flip flop these. It doesn't matter which way you go. You could also, if you wanted to, you could do a star alias, so that if you wanted to use subdomains and still serve from this same virtual host, that would work as well. So there's our first virtual host for Widget Company. We got the doc root set, we've got the error logs set, custom logs set. So now we're going to set our fallback. Which, honestly, I don't think we need the full. Simply need server name, localhost, and the document root directive. Those are really the only two directives that we need, unless you want to set a server alias. So if you want to access this default virtual host from any other machine on your local network, you can add a server alias. All right. So one of the other things that we do need to set up, however, is permissions for our sites folder. And yeah, and again, my copy and paste is not working between. So we need to set up a directory directive and tell it that C sites /public HTML. And we're going to close our directory directive. Allow override all options Actually, the indexes we probably do not need because that's kind of a security risk, but we're going to use it at the moment anyways. Follow symlinks and includes, and then require all granted. So basically this is telling Apache that it has permissions to access any public HTML folder within the sites folder. So we've got the wildcard character. So it's going to allow access to any subfolder of sites and the public HTML folder underneath that. So that should allow our virtual host to work. So I'm just going to drag this over to the other side of our screen. And the last bit that we need to do in order to get access to our new virtual host is I'm going to open an instance in Notepad as administrator. And I'm going to navigate to our Windows path. So unless you have a DNS server on your local LAN, you typically need to add host file entries. So the host file by default on a Windows machine is underneath Windows, System32, drivers, etc. And we need to view all files. And here's our default hosts. So in this instance, I am strictly going to do the local host, and I'm going to do widget company dot local, but I'm also going to add an alias for www dot widget company dot local, and we're going to save the host file. And with those configured, we should be able to restart Apache and then access our new virtual host. And we've got an error. So let me dig into this and return in a minute. All right, so digging into the error, it looks like I made a typo in my document root directive. So we're going to come back to our vhosts and widget company. And then we're going to have to fix the typo in the log directives as well. Widget company, widget company, widget company. All right. So with those corrected, we're going to come back to our services and we're going to attempt to start Apache one more time. And now it is running. It's easy for typos. So now we're going to go ahead and bring up Firefox widget company dot local. We're going to make sure that we didn't do another typo. And there we go. There's our first virtual host. And then info.php. And there we go. So there's proof in concept that everything is working as expected. So now, just to make sure that we can still get to localhost, and there is the local host that still gives us our FAQ, our how-to guides, and our PHP info. So now we're going to duplicate our virtual host, and we're going to change the domain names, developer, make sure that I don't do any more typos. Copy and paste in some of these directives using Notepad is a real pain in the rear end. So developer logs. All right. So, and again, we just need to check our host file, and you can expand, can't just make one single line entry, but just for legibility's sake, and if you remove a virtual host, I like to do standalone lines in my host file. Developer widget developer.local. Again, because we made modifications to the configuration files, we need to restart Apache, and then widget developer.local, and welcome to widget developer. Info.php. All right, so there we have two virtual hosts using custom domains on XAMPP. I'm going to go ahead and prepare to configure SSL in our next step. So we'll be back in just a little bit to set that up. I noticed one thing that I forgot to do yesterday when I was going through the virtual host configuration files. For the error log and the custom log directives, they originally had the dummy host error log and dummy host access log as the file names. I've just corrected those to just strictly be error.log and access.log. Since those are being stored in the virtual hosts logs folder, that just made a lot more sense than having to use the domain name in the log file itself. So I just wanted to make that correction before moving on to the SSL configs. So let's talk about SSL and how we can configure that. So this file, I just pre-built this. It's called server.cnf. And this file itself exists in the widget developer directory underneath the SSL folder. And then I made a second duplicate for the widget company server.cnf. So all of these directives in here set up what's required for the OpenSSL to generate a self-signed certificate. So we've got a 2048-bit key using SHA-256. The distinguished name is defined using the country, the state, the locality, the organization, organizational unit, email address, and common name elements. Encrypt key equals no. So this is super important with XAMPP because it doesn't, Apache that's bundled with XAMPP doesn't know how to read encrypted keys. So you have to tell it not to encrypt the key. Prompt equals no basically tells the command prompt not to prompt for any inputs. And then the X509 extensions is the defining the alternate names, which in this case we're using DNS record. So DNS.1 is www.widgetdeveloper.local in this case. You could turn this into a wildcard, and it would basically create a wildcard certificate when we run this. I am not going to do that in this instance. And then down below, I basically just made a cheat guide so that you don't have to type this all out by hand. So basically, from the command line, we have to run the OpenSSL command, telling it to make a request using the config that exists within this file, generate a new RSA key using X509, and it's going to be valid for 365 days. It'll write out the key into sites widget developer SSL server.key, and then the certificate file is in the site's widget developer SSL folder called server.cert. So you open a command prompt, change to the XAMPP, the XAMPP Apache bin folder, because that is where the OpenSSL executable exists. We're going to paste in our command line. And it generates the key and certificate. So if we open the SSL folder, there's our certificate file, there's our key file. And I'm going to do this exact same thing. That is the same file. I'm going to do the exact same thing with our conf file that exists in widget company. And if we change to widget company SSL, there is our key and certificate file for that. So with our certificates and keys built, we are going to go to our HTTPD SSL config file. So by default, this is already telling it to listen on port 443, which is exactly what we want. We do, however, need to define a couple additional directives. We're basically going to tell Apache to disable the strict server name lookup. And the reason behind that is depending on the browser, some older browsers don't send the host name on the initial request, which could cause an SSL error. The next item we're going to do is we're going to scroll down past all the cipher data. So here's our default SSL virtual host that's defined. I'm going to create a little bit of white space. And then we're going to define our virtual hosts, which it uses 90% of the same directives from the non-SSL. So I'm going to go ahead and copy both of these definitions and paste them in. We do need to change the port number on both. 443. And we've got our server name, doc root, server admin, document root, server name, server alias, error log, custom log, and then within our virtual host, we need to enable the SSL engine. And we need to give it SSL options. We're going to include standard environment variables, and then SSL certificate file and SSL certificate key file. So these are going to tell Apache where to look for our certificate and our key. And this is going to be server.key. And then, oh, no, wrong order. That is server.cert and widget company SSL server.key. And I'm going to copy those same 4 directives and simply change the path. So again, we've already generated our certificate and our key file using the command prompt. So now we've defined our 2 new virtual hosts. And you may ask why I use the C drive definition on the defaults, but I didn't when I defined the SSL certificate key and certificate path. Because it's the same drive, you really don't need to use the drive letter. So it's preference on which route you want to go. And since this is since the document root and the error log and the custom log, since those are within quotes, you could actually use the Windows slash versus the Unix slash to define those paths. So with those updates in place, we're going to open our services control panel and we're going to restart Apache. And we've got another error. So let's dig into that one and try to figure out what the root cause is. Okay, so digging into the error, I actually had had a couple of typos in the HTTP SSL config file. The directives should have been SSL options and then the SSL certificate key file. I misspelled those. So with those syntax items corrected, now we can start Apache. And if we come back to our browser and access widget company via HTTPS, it's going to throw this security risk because it's a self-signed certificate. All you got to do is hit advanced. It's going to tell you that it's using a self-signed certificate. You can accept the risk and it opens with SSL enabled. And we can do the same on widget developer. It's going to do the same thing because it's a self-signed certificate. And if we access info.php for both, still comes up, and it will somewhere within the info, it is going to tell you that you're using HTTPS header information. F SSL. So this is giving you all the SSL details from the environment. So this is showing you that the certificate file is in fact coming from that domain. So one of the other good things about using XAMPP on your local network is if you've got a static IP address enabled, in this case, I think this virtual machine is currently using it does not have a static IP. It's getting it from my local router. But if I go to my host system, and if I make the same host file edits, but use the IP address associated with my virtual machine, which in this case, apparently I already closed my host file on Notepad. Oh. That's right, you have to open Notepad as an administrator in order to be able to edit your host file. So this window is from my host machine. If I open my host file, and you'll see that I've already added an entry for those two domains that we just created. So if I go to https widget company.local, I get the same certificate notification, but I can access it from any machine on my local network as long as I made a host file entry. So the last bit that I want to cover is with SSL enabled, you can improve performance of XAMPP a little bit by turning on the HTTP2 module. So we're going to find our load module for HTTP2, and we're going to uncomment that line. And we're going to save that config file again. And then we're going to come back to our SSL config file. And we just need to add one more directive, and that is protocols. It would be very beneficial if I got the focus in the right window. Protocols. And it's going to be H2, which basically says I want to use HTTP2 by default. And then H2C, which is a sub protocol. And then HTTP /1.1 as a fallback. So by default, HTTP 1.1 is what the majority of browsers utilize by default. But we're telling Apache now to utilize these other performance improved protocols. So with that in place, again, we have to restart Apache. Okay, restart, no errors. And if we reload, TLS 1.3 somewhere. So here we go. Server protocol is now using HTTP 2.0 instead of 1.1. So that covers how to create virtual hosts, how to enable SSL per virtual host, and it covers how to disable the strict hostname lookup within Apache. So over roughly the last 45 minutes to an hour, we discussed where to find the XAMPP download on ApacheFriends.org. We installed XAMPP and enabled Apache and the MariaDB, also known as MySQL, as a service on your Windows machine. We configured 2 virtual hosts plus a fallback virtual host. And we also enabled SSL on our 2 custom domain virtual hosts. I tried to make sure that I covered the requirements to meet those steps. Um, if you have any feedback or comments in general, or if you just have any questions, just go ahead and post them down below. I'd love to hear your feedback, love to hear any comments or questions. I plan to do a couple more tutorials specifically on XAMPP, some of the additional features, and then I've got a whole bunch of additional tutorials that are planned. So hopefully I'll be getting to those within the next week or two. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Again, my name is Charles from CP Web Designs. I appreciate your time and hope you guys have a great day.